You ever seen someone die on camera? A snuff film is a recording of the actual murder of human that is being subsequently passed around for entertainment purposes. Suicides and accidents don't count. According to the MFA and the FCC, the FBI, and the ever-loving Snopes.com, there's no such thing as a snuff film. Yes, this includes Faces of Death. Anything you might count as being faked, falsified, or not made for that purpose, such as those tasteless videos you get on shock sites. That is a lie. There are, as best as anyone can tell, between 30 or 40 snuff films floating around out there. The earliest is a silent film on decaying nitrates collude, simply lifted La Mort devant Feu, and bears the date of 1896. The latest, judging by the hairstyles and the presence of a Frankie Says Relax t-shirt, was probably made in 1983 or 1994, is on Betamax. The films vary in violence, but they all include seemingly ritualized sex, followed by the slaying of a girl with dirty blonde hair and piercing blue eyes who appears to be around 19 years old. Every film has the exact same girl in it, the other, more girthy pasta. Of course, nobody believes in snuff films. It's just too sick to be real, right? Nobody in the right mind would actively produce evidence against them like that, let alone make money of it. Al Goldstein, publisher of Screw Magazine, has been a standing offer of $1 million American dollars for the one who can find a real, commercially sold snuff movie. The offer has been in place for years, and nobody has claimed it, and for a good reason. I mean, you don't have a carton of cigarettes and sell it for half a third of the price, do you? Besides, as far as I know, nobody has ever taken care of one of these films home. Seeing as they're not sold, as everybody thinks, that's too much of a risk. You pay to view a screening of it. Nobody ever held a copy of these films. Except, of course, for the few people who make the money off of them. As far as I know, there are only 3, all male. Actually, the only females involved in these movies are the victims. Not all movies contain rape or sex, or of any kind, but it's uncommon, especially with a few starring children as victims. This all may sound a bit odd for you all, but of course it does. It involves something that you can't exist, right? It is, though, very hard to attend one of these screenings. You need to be invited, and everyone who's been ever invited has been invited by personal mail, i.e., not the via post office. The letters are apparently drenched in some kind of chemical that makes the paper dissolve. After a certain amount of time outside, the envelope possibly in contact with air or light. I don't know. All I know is that people are clever and they take their measures. If they knew who I am, they'd surely kill me. Maybe even make me into a movie star. Then I'd be shown in their little cinema. It's quite a dark place, seeing as the only lights are candles situated around the screening room. The entrance of the snuff cinema is that of a decrepit, old factory reminiscent of a slaughterhouse. The letter would have short instructions as how to get to the screening room. The projector itself, apparently hooked by a recently bought DVD player, is powered by a car battery. I've been told they used a small gas engine back in the 30s. The chairs are the same old tables that were once used as slaughter benches. As soon as the screening is over, all of the guests, maximum 10 or so, are threatened to leave immediately through 3 different exits with 30-minute intervals. The exits are different from the entrance, as they lend to underground tunnels, probably old sewers. They lead back alleys in different parts of the city. The crew, the people who with the films, quickly vanish, probably through a 4th exit if you manage to find the screening room after a screening. You wouldn't know it was ever used for anything like that. It just looks like a walk-in freezer with white walls, meat hooks still in the ceiling, and of course the tables, still with obviously marks of old dried blood. There are about 120 snuff films to be viewed in just one cinema, and there are probably more throughout the world, each categorized by victim, method of killing, whether sex is involved, and whether it takes place in a post-mortem, and by level of brutality. At least one film is of a young blonde woman being choked to death while performing an unwilling blowjob. Another of a young child being cut open and drugged just enough to not move. But enough is still audible and visible to be awake. Yet another is of a man hung upside down by a meat hook, then having his testicles removed with a machete and force-fed them before he dies from blood loss. I could go on and on about these movies. I've seen a good portion of them. Why not? I have the money for it. The goriest film I've ever seen is that of a middle-aged dark-haired woman having her hands, feet, arms, and legs amputated while drugged, then sewn them crudely back on the wrong extremes. The next cut showed her wriggle in terror as she tried standing on her arm feet until she collapsed and vomited. A door behind her opened and a male figure swung an aluminum back at her bare head. On impact, the next bent she left gurgling cry before going limp and silent. The angle of the camera changed and the man hit her head again, this time bursting it open with the breeze of brain matter. A crying child was then shown eating her eyes. It was the most satisfying movie I've ever made. It came to him in regular intervals. At least he thought. There was no way of telling with his eyes sewn shut and nails hammered into his eardrums. Only time, touch, and sense were left for him. It's amazing how well he could still anticipate when it would attack. No matter how hard it tried to surprise, it rarely did anymore. It's a shame that he felt pride from this fact. Without warning, he'd feel his body rise off the mattress and slam hard onto the floor. He often tasted the dusty concrete floor while his face was drove into it. Just a new sensation. He'd try to block out all the pain from that throbbing, just riddled with penis spines, tearing his rectum apart, but it never got easier. Sometimes the lacerations hadn't stopped bleeding from the previous attack. It was hard to tell where one scar ended and another started with just the fingers to probe. But he liked to pretend he could count them all. Had been here days, months, or years. He used to keep track by feeling his hair growing. But when the monster realized this, his hair was set alight, leaving a print-wrinkled mess his broken eyes could only imagine. He had screamed while it happened. He'd never scream again after that thorny penis was rammed into his throat. He shuddered at the thought of the incident. It had tasted like and felt like bark, made all the more prominent by the loss of the senses. The familiar, charnel smell of the beast had filled his nostrils at the same time. Gagging had been a big mistake, though. He wished the torture would stop. Insanity would overwhelm him. Then over time sanity would seep back to him. He knew there was no end to it. This was eternity. He never knew his actions in life brought him to this. This was hell. And in hell, the devil rapes the rapist. I had never been on the deep web. Thought the whole thing sounded stupid. Some elect part of the internet with unknown atrocities living in every corner. But I was working on my master thesis in sociology, and I thought a paper on the internet subculture sounded interesting. I got together with a friend, and he talked to me about Tor, and showed me the different precautions I could take to protect my identity and my computer while browsing the deep web. I was ready to explore the bizarre hive I had heard so much about. Needless to say, for about 2 weeks, I stiffed through old websites that looked like they'd been developed during the 90s. Obscure internet relics floating out in the middle of nowhere. Derelict websites forgotten by time. Most of it was boring junk. Lots of Nazi conspiracy theories, drug traffickers, pedophiles. It was what I expected. I would have never been content to do my paper on Nazi subcultures on the deep web, or maybe even pedophiles. But I ran across something that really interested me. It was a forum awkwardly titled Enthusiasts of Suicide. The name led me to believe this forum wasn't of English-speaking origin. The forum itself had a multi-irrational array of boards for users from different countries. I saw boards in Spanish, French, Turkish, and Chinese. A vast array of boards, but there was never a common theme. Everyone on the boards was frantically obsessed with suicide. People in the English-speaking boards would share different ideas about suicide. How to execute it, how to lessen the pain for people who were afraid of suffering. Stories about friends who had committed suicide. Suicide fetishes sharing explicit pictures with one another. People having philosophical discussions about suicide. It didn't seem to stop. Then one of the boards, I noticed some of the people asking about something called The Suicide Show. It's on tonight. Are you going to watch it? One would say. No, I can't. I have a big day tomorrow. I plan on going to work with my 38 and killing my boss. Then I'm going to kill myself. The other would respond, I cringed at reading this. The Suicide Show? If it was what it sounded like, then I would be in some kind of webcast with a bunch of people committing suicide? I felt my stomach turn, and my palms were sweaty, but my mind was racing with curiosity. I had to find out what the show was all about. This suicide cult had been giving me enough material for an exciting thesis, but this would be the coup de grace. I found out the show came on in my area, and I finished around until I found the link to the show. My throat had a huge knot sitting in it, and I know I must have been sweaty. But I couldn't let my nerves get in the way of my research. I was doing important work here. The live feed came on with an eerie-sounding MDI player in the background. The film quality was grainy, as if I filmed using a cell phone or a cheap camera. A woman with a microphone held tightly in both hands stood, a forced smile on her face. I could see her mascara and run down her face as she was crying. She looked as she may be doing to the 40s. She was Asian and looked incredibly uncomfortable and afraid. I gripped the armrest of my chair, my nails digging into it. She made me uneasy. The whole thing made me uneasy, but this was getting much more strange. She started speaking in a foreign language, so I quickly clicked the button that would display the English subtitles on screen. Welcome to the Suicide Show. I'll be your host this evening, she said, her pitch shaky and unnerved. Just the sound of her frightening voice made this so much surreal and slightly nauseating. Let's start the show, she shouted with an uneasy, forced glee. She threw an arm up in the air, her teeth clenched lightly into a nervous smile, and a tear rolling down from one eye. This had to be fake. It was weird, but there was no way I was honestly about to privy what I just saw. They tried hard to convince me this was some kind of a licked game show from hell. That this woman was being held against her will, like Vanna White at gunpoint, but I wasn't biting. There wasn't no way this was happening. Our first contestant is from New York. His name is Robert Howard. She read from a cue card nervously, looking up at the camera with wild eyes. She then lowered the card. I could see her hand shaking, and the comically toothly smile flash again as she lifted a hand in the air. A spotlight highlighted the area around a man sitting in a chair. He had a shotgun in his hands. I felt my nails digging deeper into the armrest. I clenched my teeth and watched in horror. He lifted the shotgun to his mouth. I saw tears running from his eyes, and he fired. I could see the inside of his mouth light up for a brief second as the shot rang out, startlingly loud. I jerked in my chair from the sound of the blast. I saw his head jerk back briefly as a discharge of brain and blood hit the wall behind him. His head then launched forward, his upper body slumped against the folding in on itself, his head dangling. I could see the top of his head. I could see the blood and the gore, and I could see the smoke waiting from the blast that had penetrated. I had seen plenty of horror movies, and I had seen plenty of gore in the internet to know the difference. I placed my hand on my mouth. I felt the air vacate my lungs as I stared in the object of terror. Judges, the woman cried out, throwing her arms as the cheap camera swung around to highlight 3 people sitting at a table. They wore black masks, with zippers formed smiles over their mouths, and white tape formed over X's over their eyes, and small puncturings in them so they could see the show. One judge held up a 3.8, the other a 4.0, and the other judge held up a 3.5. Our next contestant is Carlos Rivera of Los Angeles, she said, moving to the next man. This man stood wearing no shirt and a simple pair of jeans. He was holding something in his right hand, and his head was hanging low. He looked like he was focusing, concentrating on something, trying to seal himself. He gritted butcher knife up to his neck and started slicing his throat. The knife cut coarsely through his skin, ripping through the flesh, but he didn't get across the entire float before he fell to his knees and grabbed his gullet with his hands. I saw blood spouting all over the floor, gushing outward from the open wound. His eyes were lit up with fear as he choked on his own blood. Look at him gush, the woman cried out, her voice a mixture of false enthusiasm, panic, and something akin to disgust. He collapsed into a pile on the floor, his legs kicking as he struggled to breathe. Judges, the woman said again, the camera swinging once more. The judges held up a 4.8, 4.9, and a 4.7 respectively. There were 2 other contestants, but I couldn't watch anymore. I closed the windows to the feed and walked over to my window. I had to catch my breath. My heart was racing. What had I just seen? I didn't sleep that night. I could see the man who had slit his own throat. I could see his eyes as he struggled to breathe through a throat full of his own blood. I could see his bloody hands clasping at his neck in some mixture of an instant reaction or regretful horror. I could see him kicking on the floor, laying sideways in a pool of his own blood. Every time I close my eyes now, it's all I see. Needless to say, I dropped the paper on the suicide enthusiast.